All right, so we're back. And today we're diving into something that's been making waves not just in the business world, but really in pop culture, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Shark Tank. You know, the show where entrepreneurs pitch their ideas to these investors, the sharks.
Right.
It's become a global phenomenon. But there's something about the Indian version, Shark Tank India, that's just really captured the imagination over there.
Yeah, it's like it's become more than just a show. It's a cultural moment.
Yeah, you see it everywhere. I mean, social media is buzzing about it, and we've got a ton of articles here talking about its impact comparisons between the Indian and the U.S. versions.
It's really fascinating stuff.
It is, and that's what we're going to dig into today, right? We're going to break down the key differences between Shark Tank India and Shark Tank U.S.
Yeah.
We'll look at everything from how those investors, well, how the sharks behave, you know, how they negotiate.
Yeah, their styles.
The kind of startups that are getting funded, well, the whole cultural context, you know, what works in India might not work in the U.S. and vice versa.
Exactly. Different worlds in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And then, of course, the big question, what kind of impact are these shows actually having on the startup scenes in each country?
Yeah, are they really moving the needle?
So let's jump right in. What really struck me when I was going through all this material is just how different the investors are. I mean, their personalities, their approaches.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You see it right away in their negotiation styles. I mean, the data here shows that, on average, the Indian sharks are coming in with offers that are like 50% lower than the valuations the entrepreneurs are asking for.
50% lower. That's a huge gap.
It is, and it makes you wonder, you know, what's going on there. Is it purely about getting the best possible deal, or is there something else at play? Maybe a different understanding of risk or something.
Yeah, and we've seen some pretty dramatic examples of that on the show, right? Like Peyush Bansal with his strict deadlines, or Ashnir Grover.
Oh, yeah.
He's known for his, shall we say, direct communication style.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it.
Not at all. And it seems like royalty clauses are much more common in Indian deals than in the U.S. deals.
That's right. The sharks in India seem a lot more likely to ask for a cut of future sales on top of their equity stake.
And why do you think that is?
Well, it could be a few things. I mean, the Indian market is maybe seen as a bit more volatile. Right. So a royalty clause gives the investor a bit of a safety net.
Mm-hmm.
They're still getting some return even if the business doesn't take off as expected.
Right, like a backup plan.
Yeah. And we also see a lot more all-shark deals in India where all the sharks on the panel decide to invest together.
Oh, yeah, that's true. You don't see that as much in the U.S. version.
Right. And that could point to a greater emphasis on shared risk, you know, spreading the risk around in a market that's maybe a little less predictable.
Makes sense. Now, how does this compare to how the sharks in the U.S. behave?
Well, they're definitely tough negotiators.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But there seems to be a much bigger emphasis on what they bring to the table beyond just money. You know?
Yeah, the whole mentorship angle.
Exactly. Their networks, their experience, their expertise, it's like they're selling themselves as much as the entrepreneurs are selling their businesses.
Right. And they often have very specific areas they focus on, like Mark Cuban with tech and sports, or Lori Greiner with retail and QVC.
Yeah, they really leverage their backgrounds, and you get the sense that they're looking for deals where they can actually add value, you know, more than just cash.
So it's less about squeezing the entrepreneur for the lowest possible valuation and more about finding the right fit, you know, someone who can really help the business grow.
Right. It's a partnership.
Now let's talk about the kinds of businesses that are getting funded, because there are some pretty clear differences there too.
Yeah, if you look at Shark Tank India, there's a definite concentration in certain sectors, like food and beverage, beauty and fashion.
Oh, yeah. Those seem to be the big winners.
And that makes sense, right? I
Yeah.
mean, India has this massive consumer market, and there's a huge appetite for these kinds of products, especially with the rise of direct-to-consumer brands.
Right. But we're also starting to see more interest and investment in tech and software, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely on the rise, especially with the government really pushing initiatives like AI and robotics.
And are those more like fundamental AI companies or more application focused?
It seems like most of them are focused on solving very specific problems within the Indian market. You know, using AI to improve existing processes or create new solutions that are really tailored to local needs.
And that actually brings up another interesting point. We see a lot of family-run businesses pitching on Shark Tank India.
Oh, yeah. That's a big difference from the U.S.
It is, and it really speaks to the importance of those family businesses in the Indian economy. It's like a whole different dynamic.
Yeah, and you also see that the Indian sharks often invest in sectors that align with their own entrepreneurial backgrounds. You know, Aman Gupta with branding and consumer goods, Namita Thapar with healthcare.
Right. They stick with what they know.
Makes sense. Now, in Shark Tank US, you see a much broader range of industries.
Oh, yeah, much more diverse.
You definitely have food and fashion, but there's a lot more tech software,
Yeah.
really unique inventions.
Yeah, like things you wouldn't see anywhere else.
Right, and again, the sharks tend to gravitate towards areas where they have expertise. Lori Greiner with retail, Mark Cuban with tech.
Right. It's all about that synergy.
Exactly, and I think that reflects the fact that the U.S. economy is just more mature and diversified.
So what about the level of innovation? You know, we hear a lot about India's startup scene, but is it really as cutting edge as what we see in the U.S.?
Well, that's a tricky question. There's a perception that Shark Tank US tends to feature more deep tech innovation.
Yeah.
Those groundbreaking ideas that are really pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, the next big thing.
They're often working on complex software,
Right.
Biotech advanced hardware, things with patents, and really unique value propositions.
Right. Shark Tank India.
It seems like there's a lot more focus on incremental improvements.
Yeah.
Taking existing products or services and adapting them for the Indian market.
Right, making them more accessible or affordable.
Exactly. And the term Jugaad innovation comes up a lot, which is all about finding clever, cost-effective solutions.
Like a workaround.
Yeah, exactly. And it's definitely effective in a market like India, where resources can be limited. But the question is, can those Jugaad innovations really scale up and compete on a global level?
That's a good question. Now, it's important to point out that we are seeing more and more deep tech startups in India.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And Shark Tank India has featured some really impressive examples of that, like SNITCH, the fast fashion brand that's using data to really stay ahead of the trends.
Yeah, that's a great example.
So while the balance might be different, the innovation is definitely there in India.
Absolutely. It's just evolving.
Okay, so we see all these deals happening on the show, but the big question is how many of them actually close? Once the cameras are off.
Right, because it's one thing to shake hands on TV, but it's another thing to actually get the lawyers involved and sign the paperwork.
Exactly. And this is where we see some really interesting differences between the two shows.
Yeah, in Shark Tank India, the closure rates have been all over the place. Season 1 was apparently somewhere between 40 and 66%, but then season 2 jumped up to like 96%.
Well, that's a huge jump.
It is. And there's been a lot of speculation about why that happened. Did they change the format of the show? Was there more due diligence going on behind the scenes?
And what are the entrepreneurs saying about their experiences?
Well, some of them have reported that deals fell apart after the show. Maybe the terms changed or the sharks just lost interest.
Buyer's remorse.
Kind of. And there have even been accusations of commitment ghosting where a shark just disappears after the initial excitement.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt.
Yeah, and it seems like the biggest sticking points are things like valuation equity splits and those royalty clauses we talked about.
Right, so even if you get a deal on the show, it's not always smooth sailing.
No, not necessarily. Now, in Shark Tank US, the closure rate is generally lower than that 96% we saw in India. It's usually estimated to be below 50%.
So still a pretty significant number of deals don't make it to the finish line?
Right, and the reasons tend to be things like discrepancies in the due diligence process. Maybe the numbers weren't quite what they seemed, or disagreements over the final terms.
So both shows have their share of post-show drama.
Yeah, it's the nature of the game, I guess.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the cultural side of things. The tone of the shows and how the entrepreneurs actually pitch their ideas. Because that's where you really see the differences between India and the U.S.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really stands out about Shark Tank India is just how much emotion is involved.
Oh.
The entrepreneurs often share really personal stories about their struggles, their families, what motivates them.
It's very heartfelt.
It is. And there's a real emphasis on connecting with the sharks on a personal level, building rapport, highlighting the social impact of their businesses or how they're relevant to the Indian context.
And you often get those dramatic musical cues and the theatrical lighting. It's very much tailored to Indian sensibilities.
Yeah, it's like a Bollywood movie in a way.
And how does that compare to the U.S.?
Well, in Shark Tank US, the pitches are much more data-driven. It's all about the numbers, the market opportunities, scalability, the return on investment.
It's very business-like.
Yeah, very straightforward.
Yeah.
While they might share personal stories, it's not the main focus. It's like, here's my product, here's the market, here's how much money I need.
No time for tears.
Exactly, different priorities.
All right, so we've talked about the sharks, the startups, the deals. But the big question is, what kind of impact are these shows actually having on the startup ecosystems in their respective countries?
Right, because ultimately that's what it's all about,
Yeah. Are they really making a difference?
Well, there's no doubt that Shark Tank India has been a huge boost for the Indian startup scene.
Yeah.
I mean, it's generated so much interest from investors. Capital is flowing more freely.
It's like it's legitimized entrepreneurship in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And even businesses that don't get a deal on the show often see a big spike in brand awareness and customer acquisition just from being on TV.
It's great publicity.
And it's really inspired a whole new generation of entrepreneurs, particularly in smaller cities and towns where maybe that entrepreneurial spirit wasn't as strong before.
It's like it's shown them that it's possible, you know?
Right. And the government has really embraced the show, too. It aligns perfectly with their Startup India initiative.
So it's become a real cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, big time.
What about Shark Tank US? What kind of impacts has it had?
Well, it's definitely provided a massive platform for startups, a huge exposure to investors and customers.
And it's helped to fuel that entrepreneurial spirit that's always been strong in the U.S.
Yeah, and we've seen some amazing success stories like Bombas with their socks and Scrub Daddy with their sponges.
Yeah, they've become household names.
So both shows are having a positive impact. But it seems like Shark Tank India is playing a more transformative role.
Right.
Really changing perceptions and opening up opportunities in a way that's maybe more profound.
Yeah, it's really shaking things up.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing, the whole psychology of valuation. How do the sharks decide what a business is actually worth?
Yeah, because we've talked about how the Indian sharks tend to negotiate really hard on valuation.
Right. And it's probably a mix of factors. I mean, there's the financial aspect, of course, but there's also the mentorship piece. Maybe they feel like a larger equity stake justifies the time and effort they're going to invest in guiding the startup.
Makes sense. And there's been some debate about whether the show itself might be inflating valuations, especially for certain consumer-facing businesses.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's like the publicity from the show is creating a bit of a halo effect.
Right. So what about the U.S. sharks? What are the psychological factors at play there?
Well, research has shown that entrepreneurs who project confidence and competence tend to get better offers.
Fake it till you make it.
Right. And interestingly, some studies have found that entrepreneurs who are perceived as very attractive or likable might actually get lower offers.
Really? So being too charming can backfire?
Apparently. So maybe the sharks think they have more leverage in those situations.
Fascinating stuff. So it's not just about the numbers. There's a lot of psychology involved.
Oh, yeah. Tons of it.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about audience engagement because both shows have really captured the public's imagination.
Yeah, they've become more than just TV shows. They're like cultural touchstones.
And Shark Tank India seems to have a really high level of interactivity. People are talking about it online, debating the deals, sharing their own entrepreneurial aspirations.
Yeah, it's become a real community, and I think that reflects the excitement around entrepreneurship in India right now. It's seen as a path to success and a way to make a difference.
Right. And the show has done a great job of making it accessible to everyone. I mean, they even explain basic startup terms on screen.
Yeah, that's so smart. It's like they're educating the audience along the way.
And then there's the diversity of the entrepreneurs themselves on Shark Tank India. You see people from all walks of life, different backgrounds, different regions.
Yeah, it's really inspiring.
And the sharks often co-invest in deals, which shows a real spirit of collaboration.
Yeah, they're all in it together.
Okay, but we can't ignore the challenges. Right? Entrepreneurs in India face some unique hurdles that their counterparts in the U.S. might not have to deal with as much.
Right. There's still a lot of societal skepticism towards entrepreneurship. Some people see it as too risky.
That's understandable.
And then there's the regulatory environment, which can be pretty complex.
Yeah. Bureaucracy is a big issue.
Plus, the Indian market is incredibly price sensitive. So entrepreneurs really have to be creative about keeping costs down.
So it's a tough landscape, but there's so much potential.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's wrap this up. What are the key takeaways when we compare these two shows?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that while they share a core format, they're really a reflection of their respective cultures and economies.
So Shark Tank India is all about aggressive negotiation, adapting to the local market, and really tapping into that emotional connection with the audience.
Yeah, and it's having a huge impact on India's startup scene, making entrepreneurship more mainstream and inspiring a whole new generation.
Whereas Shark Tank US is more about strategic partnerships and backing those really disruptive, innovative ideas.
Right. It's a different game, but just as exciting.
So fascinating contrasts all around, and it really makes you think about the bigger picture. What does the success of Shark Tank India tell us about the future of entrepreneurship in a rapidly developing economy?
Yeah, and what can entrepreneurs and investors learn from comparing these two platforms?
It's all about finding that balance between local relevance and global ambition.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all take away from this, whether we're in India or the U.S. or anywhere else in the world.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.